Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelles. NATO's new wonder weapon for its Ukraine proxy is missiles and drones. The logic is missiles and drones alone will force Russia to end the conflict and surrender. Russia would not dare to escalate to strike NATO in return. This is called brinkmanship, and it's very dangerous. Cross-talking brinksmanship, I'm joined by my guest, Alex Reportify in China. He is a geopolitical analyst. In Stockholm, we have Nilsson. He is a senior analyst at Dissident Club. And in Lisbon, we cross to Alexander Guerrero. He is an international legal analyst. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Alex, let me go to you first in China. Thank you. I'm sure it's a very delicate hour there. We have it. Everything is clear now. The so-called spirit of Ankara is gone. Maybe it never existed. Marco Rubio said that there was no proposal. It was his proposal. It was the American proposal, but I guess it didn't catch on, okay? And where we stand now, President Putin came out last week in a very high-profile appearance that Russia is preparing for war against Europe because Europe has made it very, very clear that it is planning for war against Russia. Where do we go from here? Alex.
Well, I mean, it's very apparent here that NATO tries to play two goalposts here. One, they say, well, we will support Ukraine, but we can't actively put feet and soldiers and boots on the ground. But collectively, they have put billions of dollars of hardware, military hardware, in the hands of Ukrainians and other various mercenaries that are fighting for Ukraine at that time and this time. So you are correct. This is brinkmanship. It is about to get hot. It's about to get really hot in this part of the world. And the warning shots were there last week. You could read the code that Putin is basically saying, get ready, look out. We're ready for you, boys. If you want to press the button, we got more buttons, and it's going to get nasty real fast.
Yeah, Alex, you put it very clearly. That was the message I got. Okay, that's how I received that. Okay, Mats, you know, you're in the neighborhood, as it were. So we had 40 days of the United States and Israel attacking Iran using missiles and drones, and they lost. Why does European NATO, we can talk about the American element later, why do they think they can succeed where the Americans and the Israelis didn't?
I actually don't think they really believe that they can succeed, but they are stuck in a situation of, shall we call it, intensified gray zone asymmetric responses against Russia. They will continue to escalate, knowing full well that the threshold for a catastrophic Russian response is still some ways away. Now, the danger with this is that concerning Russia's response, it will probably be a response within the gray area, thereby meaning that the response will not be tanks rolling across the Baltic border. It will not be tanks rolling into Poland. It will be one of these more ambiguous kind of retaliations, meaning that this will test the alliance and it will prove that perhaps the alliance will be divided. And this is the real danger, because as you know, all organizations and empires, they appear stable until the moment that they are not. So the Seneca Cliff whisper that is nearing NATO is if there is a ambiguous attack on a NATO territory and Article 5 fails to materialize, and that will quickly end NATO's credibility and leave Europe very fragmented and in a very, very vulnerable situation. So the European Union and NATO in Europe is playing a very, very high-staked game, considering the level of options that Russia still has in really testing the Article 5 issue.
All right, let's talk about Article 5. Alexander, you're in Portugal right now. So let's say, hypothetically, an example here is that Russia reveals its red line, no more strikes, missile strikes coming from Ukraine through Latvia, through the Baltic countries, no more. And if you do it, we will strike a military facility, or maybe more rather, a missile facility in Germany. That happens. So Portugal, people in Portugal go, rush into the street wanting to go to war with Russia. Is that going to happen?
No, not really. Actually, the kind of speech here is very cautious, the one that we hear here, because on the one hand, no one wants confrontation with Russia, especially because there is, everybody suspects that NATO cannot win a war against Russia. So there is the fear, although at the same time, we find exactly attempts of provocations against Russia in order to try to persuade Moscow to escalate any kind of attempt, any kind of event that Ukraine leads against Russian territory. Here, one of the things that actually had appalled me the most was the fact that we heard that Russian missiles cannot target Portuguese military targets here, which I thought it was pure illusion. People were totally away from reality, and people were in denial because they have no idea about Russia's military capability, especially towards targets, intercontinental targets. So this, for me, appalled me a lot because I saw how people were kind of relieved to know, or at least expecting, that Russia could not target Portugal, but all other targets in the European Union, yes, they could. At the same time, let me add this, please, because what we see here is the European Union trying to provoke more and more Russia in order to see if the Russians fall on this kind of trap, and they will escalate. I don't see that coming for many reasons. First, because Russia has many other means to answer to these kind of attacks, and then because Russia must continue doing especially what they have been doing. Even recently, we've heard about more attacks in Kiev against military infrastructures and targets, and they must keep going like that. Russia has this capacity. Russia has not even used its full military capacity in case of need. I don't see Russia giving reasons for NATO to invoke Article 5.
Yeah, well, okay, let me quote a diplomatic genius, apparently. Her name is Kaya Kallas. I must admit I appreciate her dress code, her intellect not so much. I'm quoting here. We keep rising the costs of the Ukraine conflict until Russia understands it cannot win. Alex, how is Europe, how is NATO going to win? I don't understand it. She's not very articulate, if you know what I mean. Alex.
Well, I think she should be a little bit more concerned about her 90,000 of her 1 million population that are on a gray passport in that country, alien passports, who are of ethnic Russian speakers. They should be concerned about that, as well as other parts of Europe that are connected to other zones of ethnic speaking Russians, like the Pridnestrovsky Moldavska Republika, PMR, which is in between, sandwiched in between the Ukraine and Moldova. These are two very interesting territories that are going to come into play here in the next couple of weeks. And if anything, that is more territory, and that is on the doorstep at Europe at this time, not this little buffer zone of Ukraine that we got. You know, Russia, you know, they favor, you know, a highly calculated systemic approach here. You know, they can absorb these strikes on their territory, but I'm telling you, when the guilty always scream the loudest, the Zelensky boys, they start screaming when Rezniks start slamming into the streets of Kiev. Those are just warning shots. Again, territorial integrity, well, that's going to be tested here in the next couple of weeks. It wouldn't surprise me, as we know that Moldova is not part of the European Union, but has its wishes and dreams to get there, that territory and the neighboring breakaway PMR, or otherwise known as Transnistria of old, I don't think they use that text anymore for that region. but that is going to come under serious gameplay action
Well,
here.
Alex,
Watch.
I think
Gonna get interesting.
I think irrespective of what happens in Ukraine, that's going to happen anyway, because when this conflict in Ukraine comes to an end, it doesn't mean NATO's war or hybrid war against Russia is going to end. This is the long haul. But, Matt, that's the whole point of this here. I mean, we all know this. We watch this in real time every single day. And I can tell you, being a resident here, these missile strikes attacking civilians, and obviously it's a form of terrorism. There's a certain point where the Russians will say, just enough is enough. I mean, this is not going to be something that will go on for much longer. Mats.
That's very true, and there's a problem here. There is a Western strategic goal that has basically been going on for maybe 120 years now, basically led by the British, to bleed Russia dry and to try to keep Russia contained. But the problem is that the Western analysis of Russia is fundamentally flawed, because it kind of projects Western geopolitical games, and the Western leaders are operating from a different mindset. Russia is now operating on a civilizational and within a spiritual framework. And by that, I mean, Russia has a different kind of preparedness and has a different approach to this conflict. There are certain dimensions to this. For example, for Russia, it's not just military, but civilizational, like I said. You have the religious aspect of it, that Russia is a defender of traditional values against a secular, consumerist, and morally basically decaying Western empire. And this isn't propaganda. I mean, it's a deeply held beliefs that kind of provides the metaphysical justification for the suffering that the Russian people are ready to go through in order to hold the enemy at the gates.
Matt, on this point, I have to jump in. We're going to have to go to a hard break. And after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on brinkmanship. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelles. To remind you, we're discussing brinkmanship. Okay, I want to go back to Mats in Stockholm. You were bringing up some fascinating points before we went to the break. If I could just kind of sum up, and I'd like you to continue. This project, as you point out, we had Napoleon, we had Hitler, they both had coalitions. There's a new coalition now. What level the United States is playing in, we can debate it probably for another program. But in summation, for Russia, this is existential, and it's not existential for Europe. Maybe ideologically it is, but not in terms of security. Mats, continue.
No, that's exactly the point. It is for Russia. And for Russia, Russia are prepared to go through sacrifices that the European Union and the NATO states in Europe never will. And it's about the inheritance of the Great Patriotic War. And also it's the distinct idea that Russia doesn't really need Europe anymore. It's kind of moved into its Eurasian soul, making itself self-reliant and immune to Western pressure, and thereby enhancing its civilizational preparedness together with China now to start pushing back against Europe. And they have the capacity, because Russia cannot be defeated. From this perspective, a negotiated peace with the current NATO leadership is ontologically impossible for Russia.
At the very best, it would be a pause, I think you would agree. And for those that think that, Russians are begging for sanction relief, there's a lot of people like me that say, please keep the sanctions, keep them on, okay? Break away from the West. That is the best thing that Russia can do. That's my own personal opinion. Alexander, let's go back to you in Lisbon. Europe is preparing for war against Russia. Can it win a war against Russia?
I think it's highly unlikely that to happen for many reasons. Not only because it would be a totally unbalanced war between Russia and NATO, because Russia has many other means and one-of-a-kind type of weapons that, for example, NATO members combined, they don't have access to. The only alternatives here is either they use the several conventional weapons they have, or they escalate to the nuclear weapons, while Russia, for example, they have several others in between that they can use. They have already shown it to us, and it was quite clear that they were quite effective and they can work. On top of that, there is also the other kind of weapons that can be used. And we can see, for example, you were discussing the matter of sanctions. We can see how Russia's economy is going and not only surviving, but it's growing year by year. It keeps not only resilience, but it keeps growing and increasing and developing. Sometimes into some countries, sanctions actually, they are an opportunity to develop the economy and also all the means that the country has. And I think Russia is doing quite well. But when we have to compare the capability of NATO members and of Russia, I see, honestly speaking, that we have the advantage running in favor of Russia. We listened weeks ago about Germany's army chief saying that Germany and all NATO members should prepare for confrontation with Russia way before 2019. And it came fastly. The representative of NATO came to public saying, we have the information that Russia doesn't want any kind of confrontation. Just to make it clear that even NATO, they are not interested on any kind of war with Russia. Let me tell you that if they had suspicions that they could win a war against Russia, that kind of act would have happened long time ago, because they knew they had the advantage. And presently, they know they don't have such advantage. They don't have the means. That's why they keep investing in the same tactic of fueling and financing Ukraine and other kind of proxies in order to try to see if Russia by itself falls, which is unlikely to happen.
You know, it's very interesting, gentlemen. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of this intense propaganda campaign. Ukraine is winning, Russia is losing. It's really full blasts on social media here. And you know what? I'll tell you, it's been really successful. This propaganda has captured Western audiences. They actually believe a lot of this stuff, but the rest of the world doesn't believe it. And that is a big difference that's evolved through this conflict. Let me go back to Alex in China. I suppose one of the big wild cards in all of this is Donald Trump, as usual. Recently we had the E3 meeting. Sorry, Starmer won't be at the next one. And then we had G7, and then they trotted out Zelensky and trying to convince Donald Trump that Ukraine can win. Now, you can make arguments on both sides. Trump needs a win. He needs a win because he lost in Iraq. But will he go into a conflict using the same advisors that turned Iraq into a debacle? Will Iran into a debacle? I really don't know, okay? He does need a win, but this could be a double whammy loss if he goes along with it. Alex?
I think invite him in. It's to the advantage of the Russians. I mean, how do you see an economy that had great trade with America, great trade with Europe, implode overnight? Invite the Americans and invite, number 10 into the discussion, and you will see your economies evaporate. This is what's happened. Russia has now come into the arms of China. Trade is over $300 billion a year here. During this Iranian situation that we saw in the Middle East, well, the oil was still flowing from Russia to China, and so was the Chinese RMB. So when it comes to negotiations, I mean, it's great. You can bring in Jared Kushner. I nickname him the Undertaker because when you sit down with him about 48 hours later, you're usually dead or killed. You can just ask the Iranians that. And he can bring the comedy club along with him. But that's not going to work here. We have to remember who we're talking to here. We are talking to Russia. Russia is a nuclear power, not someone seeking to be a nuclear power. They are. And when they are sitting at the other end of the table, you cannot hold a knife to their neck because, well, it's going to come with serious consequences. And that usually means territory. As I said earlier in the program here, I think Russia will continue to capture more territory. Doesn't matter if the media blitz and the Zelensky and Instagrammers are trying to convince people in the West. That's not happening. In the headlines here in China, we know that it is Russia. When they want to end this, they will end it on their terms, no one else's.
Well, it's very clear, gentlemen, that this will end on the battlefield. The Europeans have made it very clear that they're not interested, maybe incapable of negotiation. Mats, I'm an academic historian by training, and modern European history was my thing. And it seems to me that the current generation of leaders in Europe, they're not afraid of war. Why? Why is that?
I think it's down to experience and knowledge. They haven't experienced war. And unfortunately, there's a German word called Bildung. They probably haven't had enough Bildung. And by that, I mean they haven't read the journals of those who participated in the European wars of the previous generations. So they don't really understand what total war means. And the Europeans are, in a sense, trapped in a rationalist kind of post-historical mindset. So they can't really process either of the United States or the Russian realities. Europe assumes that both the United States and Russia kind of are rational actors seizing to an optimal material outcome, either territory or security guarantees. But, looking at Trump and looking at Putin, I see that the primary actors, they are operating on totally different planes. Trump is in a realm of pure power and pure deception and pure material gains, and Russia is in a realm of historical and spiritual destiny, which means that Europe, they can't comprehend either parties in this struggle, meaning that they are, as you say, left out and, unfortunately and very dangerously, clueless to the consequences of their constant, dare I say, warmongering against Russia.
Well, it seems to me, Alexander and Lisbon, this new militarism is a substitute for the failings of the EU itself.
Well, basically, what I can tell you is that this militarization of the European Union is an opportunity for the signing of several agreements with companies from the military sector. That's what I see, especially here in Europe. Not only with German ones, but also with Czech companies, with many other companies. This is a great chance for many people to earn money with it. But at the same time, I don't see how this capability of the European Union member states will increase, at least in the short term, especially when you expect to have a confrontation. If you really expect to have a confrontation with Russia in the short term, you are not hiring and getting equipment enough, like the technology is not well developed in order to go into such confrontation. So what I see is a lot of opportunities with the companies from the military sector, defense sector, and at the same time, what I see is a lot of people that don't want confrontation with Russia, but they are expecting Russia to fall by itself. They want to gain time to see if Russia falls or if Russia commits some kind of mistake so that it becomes totally independent and isolated in the political international sphere.
It's really interesting, gentlemen, is that you have the elites in Europe that have this is their project that enriches them. It is a reflection of their ideology. And if you really kind of distill it all down, some people get air conditioning and some people don't, okay? It's the people that get the air conditioning, they get their wars. But the rest of us, we just wilt in this horrible, 40-degree, 45 Celsius weather. That's the fate we're all given here. Gentlemen, that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in Stockholm, Lisbon, and in China. And of course, I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.